Right, in this video, we're going to talk about sustainability issues in cities, mainly related to how they grow. So if you want to pause and read through the learning objective and the essential knowledge, that might not be a bad idea. Um, but we're going to be talking about some of the issues related to growth in cities and how growth can occur in sustainable ways. So think about cities. There's kind of two ways that they typically can grow. They can grow up at higher densities, kind of within the city, usually, or they can grow outward at lower densities, usually through things like single-family homes on the outskirts of cities. So thinking about that question of how cities grow, here are some key vocabulary we're going to talk about. So mixed-use zoning, infill development, new urbanism, smart growth, slow growth, and green belts. Those are the kind of 6 terms that are in this that are going to be important. And the questions we're talking about. How do you convert more urban space to higher density patterns of living? So what are some methods that cities use? And then how do cities grow in sustainable ways and prevent large amounts of growth in low density areas? So those are kind of the big things we're talking about. So the first thing you see here is a zoning map of Inkster, Michigan. It has the designation of being the zoning map that comes up when you Google the term zoning map. But it actually works pretty well for this. So you can see all the different ways in which this small city or community zones its space, right? So one of the things that you'll see is most of the space is zoned for one single family residential areas. And this is pretty common. And that is exactly what it sounds like. And you have single families living together. And you see other ways in which a city might be zoned. So we have things like multiple dwelling, multiple family, office district, business district. You do have 1 or 2 or 3 or a couple mixed use districts, business districts, industrial districts, and the town center, right? So you have kind of the typical zoning map here. So one of the methods that cities can actually use to grow in more sustainable ways is to convert more parts of the city that are zoned for single uses, like the ones we see here. These are all sort of single use areas, including what we call single family housing. To mixed use zoning, right? So making more flexibility kind of within zoning for cities to grow and have kind of multiple things in the certain part of town. And sometimes even like what you see in the picture where you have, a restaurant on the bottom and then apartments on the top, kind of that idea of having kind of multiple uses in one plot of land. So oftentimes this happens through the process of what we would call infill development. When the kind of new buildings or new businesses or residential areas are built kind of in vacant or underused parts of already developed parts of the city, right? So trying to take the urban space that already exists and transform it into kind of new mixed use kind of services or residences that might be able to kind of allow the city to build at higher and higher densities within the urban area. So some of the benefits of this is, as we just said, cities build at higher densities, kind of upward rather than outward, right? Increased walkability within the city, so you might be able to kind of cut down on the amount of driving, or you might be able to kind of make the parts of the city self-contained in a lot of ways. And you might also, as a benefit, increase the supply of affordable housing. And affordable housing, your mileage may vary in terms of affordable within various cities. But thinking about that, more supply within a lot of cities across the country have housing crises that are essentially caused by shortages of housing, right? Oftentimes because most of the city or a lot of the city might be zoned for only a single use or specifically zoned for single family housing. So opening up and increasing the supply of housing does a lot to alleviate this problem. And then some challenges you'll see is NIMBYism. So the term NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. So that is oftentimes when there are new projects or attempts to change zoning, things like that, they run into pretty fierce resistance from people who like the city the way it is, or like their neighborhood the way it is, or don't want more people in their neighborhood. They might be scared off by some of the logistical challenges of change, kind of having more people in space. Things like parking or traffic or transportation. Construction is often a big one too. Anti-construction is always a kind of a thing that local government might face. And then gentrification is also an interesting kind of connection to this, right? So we talked about gentrification in a different way previously. But if you were talking about the building of new businesses in residential areas, kind of in places that might be underused, they still might be being used by certain people, right? There still might be still might be a pre-existing community there. So if you have that, then oftentimes I would say that the process of a gentrification, or what we would call gentrification, oftentimes occurs when you have kind of that amount of investment that's happening within part of a city. All right, so mixed use zoning is kind of one tool in the arsenal of what we are going to call kind of two different things that are pretty close to meaning the same thing. They do have a slight difference, and we'll talk about that. But new urbanism and smart growth. So these are kind of ways in which cities and communities and neighborhoods are trying to encourage more sustainable patterns of growth, or trying to kind of reimagine what a city might look like. So oftentimes, I'll show you some pictures. These are sort of the some of the prime examples of new urbanist communities. And new urbanism generally has a connotation of being focused on like a smaller scale or an individual neighborhood. And smart growth is more about how the whole city is growing. So it's more focused on the city and the region. But oftentimes there's a huge amount of overlap between the two. And they basically sort of mean a lot of the same things on a different level. So tenets of new urbanism, and really also smart growth, is building at higher densities than other kind of previously zoned parts of the city. Having a lot of diverse housing types, things like apartments and condos and single family houses and townhomes, sort of all different tools in the arsenal. Mixed use zoning, as we talked about, being defined by sort of increased levels of walkability and the ease of public transportation, and also integrating a lot more like green space and having that just be like part of the way that the city is constructed intentionally, rather than oftentimes how cities are, where it's nice when parks happen, but there's oftentimes they weren't constructed intentionally that way initially, and then sort of just this general idea of having more connectivity between the different uses for things in the city. So here we see Seaside, Florida is like one of the prototype new urbanist communities, and within a lot of big cities, you'll see things that might look like new urbanism or look like kind of these types of neighborhoods, right? Kind of mixed use residential neighborhoods, oftentimes with a lot of things that are somewhat appealing to younger folks kind of within them too. So that is one way, right? Smart growth, right? Trying to think about ways to use the city and reimagine space within the city. The other way is through slow growth. So slow growth is slowing down the development and growth of the city, sort of usually on the outside of the city, right, on the periphery. So the easiest way to slow down the growth of the city is to just say, hey, we're going to slow down the growth of the city. So that is to pause or limit kind of the horizontal development on the periphery of a city. So oftentimes cities might institute something called an urban boundary, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? Kind of a boundary around the city in which it says no more growth kind of outside of this area. And the term you see at the bottom, green belt, is oftentimes a good way to do this, where you have a policy and land use designation where you're going to use undeveloped wild or agricultural land kind of to surround the city to stop its growth. So this is one way to do that, is to just sort of put a boundary and limit growth outside of it. Other ways to kind of slow growth is to make transportation sort of easier in the core of the city, or to connect it more easily, or to have public transportation that is connected in with the core of the city, and then not connected, and then the parts that you don't want connected to the city, right? And also to provide economic incentives or disincentives for building in parts of a city. So easing zoning regulations, or instituting kind of more or fewer restrictions based on where you want growth to happen or not happen. And one of the things that's difficult for cities is oftentimes cities might do this, but then the surrounding suburbs around them, might not have the same rules. So it's tough, because you have to have sort of entire regions working together to make a functional urban area, which oftentimes it doesn't happen. So the various municipalities and cities are kind of a mishmash of different policies and zones and rules and things like that, which makes things tough. So challenges, that's one. Challenges to the implementation of these policies, that would have been a good one too, is just having different levels of government that are oftentimes not coordinating. And some people just have the general belief that that's not the government's job to try to restrict or control or sort of like spur development or growth happening in the way that it wants to, right? Feel like it should happen some sort of organic way. There are those that would argue that, like the stock of affordable housing might drop if you are limiting horizontal development or saying, no more growth happening outside of these boundaries. That might kind of, at least in the short term, kind of further a housing crisis if there are not enough affordable housing to start with. There is always the idea of NIMBYism, or kind of worrying about property values or things like that. So people might not want cities to try to transform the space that they live in, and change kind of the way it's zoned or change the way it's used. And kind of one other thing that I can think of is that cities are already oriented often in a very automobile specific way, and increasing levels of investment in transportation infrastructure that's not automobile oriented is very, very expensive, right? So it might be a challenge to do that well. All right, thanks. Bye.